Masking can lead to an increase of suicidal thoughts and extreme exhaustion. So according to this recent study, we do know that it's not particularly good for us. But you might ask, well, what about the stigma that is connected to my diagnosis? Or you wonder, well, aren't we kind of playing social roles all the time anyway? So how do I know that what I do is not good for me? My name is Arije. I have a MA in Education Studies and I coach dyslexic adults. I'm also dyslexic myself. And in this video, I would like to dive into the topic of masking by utilizing concepts from the psychologist Carl Jung. Jung is one of the most influential psychologists in history. And with his model of the psyche, we can gain insight into the phenomenon of masking on a whole different level. I structured the content by first explaining to you Jung's model. Then I have a study for you on the topic of masking involving people with autism, dyslexia, and other neurodivergent conditions. And we're going to combine the two so that you have a better idea of what masking is like, also in practice. And then we're taking a look at the topic of stigma and stigmatization and how it affects masking. And lastly, we're going to answer the question, what you can do about it. So let's get to it. For our purposes, it will be enough if we go over the central elements of Jung's model. So on the one side, we have the outer world, which is basically our social environment. And then we have the persona, and that can be seen as the mask that we wear or the social roles that we play. So this element kind of symbolizes the roles that we are playing in society. So you, for example, play a different role when you're at home compared to the role that you play when you're at work. And there isn't necessarily a negative connotation attached to it. And then there's the ego, and that's the part that you think of when you think of you. So it's your conscious awareness. It's where your thoughts, memories are, and it's also what helps you to give direction to your life. And then there's the shadow, one of the most interesting elements of Jung's model, in my opinion. And into the shadow go all elements of ourselves that we reject, that we do not want to accept, or that we push into unconsciousness. And that stems from our upbringing. So we learn that certain things are okay and others aren't. And then certain elements of ourselves become repressed. So for men, that often tends to be our anger. And when it's pushed into the shadow, then it also becomes unconscious. So we don't really know that we have this element within us. But that doesn't mean that we cannot become conscious of it again if we put in some effort. Now, the idea is that if we want to develop as a person, we need to integrate our shadow, because like our actual shadow, it can't be argued away. These elements that we do not like about ourselves, they're going to be there. And if we don't give them a place, then that creates issues. So in order to become whole as a person, he argues it needs to be integrated. And by the way, also from modern research, we know that repressed emotions lead to a whole slew of negative consequences. Like, for example, a negative impact on the immune system, cortisol dysregulation. Some studies literally say that you're more likely to die if you repress your emotions. Now, there is a big problem connected to the task of integrating your shadow, and this is something that Jung describes in his book, The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious. He writes, "The shadow is a tight passage, a narrow door, whose painful constriction no one is spared, who goes down the deep well. If we step through the door of the shadow, we discover with terror that we are the object of unseen factors. The light of consciousness is extinguished, and the dark sea of unconsciousness breaks in." So if we take a good look at ourselves and discover these hidden elements, then we suddenly realize that we were guided by things that were beyond our control. You know, maybe you see, oh my God, my dyslexia has had such a big influence on my life, and I wasn't even aware of it. So that can be a big shock, and that can also sometimes prevent us from even looking. In the moment where you do look, the dark sea of unconsciousness breaks in, and you might wonder, what else is there that I'm not aware of? Now we're moving on to the second part of our video where we integrate this study into our model. The researchers took a look at the experience of masking among different groups. Group of people with autism. They also had a group of individuals that had a different diagnosis, like, for example, ADHD or dyslexia. And then there was one group that didn't have a diagnosis at all. Generally speaking, their takeaway was that masking had a negative impact on these people, and they tended to feel disconnected from themselves when they were masking. If we now go back to Jung's model, I would like to start with the persona, so with the mask itself, and what impact it has on the connections we are able to create with other people. For this, I would like to read you a quote. And this is said by an autistic man. He writes, "Some people who were friends before are puzzled by this different me. It's scary for me." So this man wanted to mask less. However, his mask was so convincing in the past that now people around him are confused. And the reason for this is that we as outsiders only have the persona or the mask that we can connect to. And if the discrepancy is too large, then, we're not really connecting to you, but we're connecting to a facade that isn't really you. And that can create problems. This woman, for example, reports, "My ex told me that I was faking being autistic." So this person suddenly ends up in a situation where her husband, in this case, believes that the mask is the real her and doesn't really believe whatever she reveals is under the mask. And that can be incredibly frustrating. If we go into the topic of masking even deeper, then we get to the ego, so the part of ourselves that is conscious, and basically the inner dialogue. And for this element, I also have two examples for you that illustrate, I think, quite well what's happening. One person without any diagnosis reports, "I feel as though I am wearing a different person. I don't know where I went or who I could have become if I haven't been forced to be someone else." This neurodivergent man, age 33, writes, "I think I am very good at masking. So good I'm struggling to tell what's mask and what is not." If we think about it in this way, masking becomes actually something that is properly scary because it causes us to lose ourselves. And that would mean that it becomes really hard to make decisions. Being authentic wouldn't really be possible. And we would be kind of steered by other factors rather than our own. So all things that aren't particularly good, but if we think about it in this way, if we are aware of these consequences that are generally negative, then it should motivate us to integrate more of our shadow, and that can only be a good thing. We become more whole as a person, as an individual, and it means that we stop denying ourselves our own individuality, and I think that's huge. Another important insight from our study has to do with the question, why do we actually mask? And their answer is because we're afraid of being stigmatized. And since you might be worried about that as well, I would like to briefly talk about that. The mistake that people tend to make when it comes to this is that they believe that if I don't label myself, then there won't be any label, so people won't judge me. However, there's also a lot of informal labeling that happens. So if a dyslexic is not identified, then he or she is often seen as stupid or lazy. So one argument that can be made is that the informal labels are often more harsh than the formal ones. And there's one more point that I would like to make when it comes to stigma. And this is probably something you haven't heard before, because some groups of individuals actually experience an increase in self-esteem when they're being stigmatized. And that has to do with the question whether or not you agree with the negative statement that is made about you. So if you say, well, yeah, these negative things that they say about me, they're true, then that tends to have a negative impact on your self-esteem. However, if you get angry and you feel like, I'm going to prove to you that I can do it anyway, then we actually see an increase in self-esteem. And you might belong to the second group when you're being stigmatized. The question now becomes, how do we mask less? Or how do we integrate our shadow? And for this, I'm gonna give you an example of something that I realized around 3 years ago. Back then, I was talking to my girlfriend, which is now my wife, and we were having a conversation about the education system and my experience in school when I was a child. And at some point, I said, I want to burn it all down. And I was kind of, she was a little bit shocked by it. I was also kind of shocked by the fact that it felt kind of extreme. And what happened there, I believe, is that I tapped into some of my anger that was living within my shadow. So the first step that I went through here is awareness. So the realization that I have this anger within me. And then step number 2 would be acceptance. So to allow that feeling to be there, contrary to what I did in the past. And then there's step number 3, integration. And that would involve self-reflection, and telling your own story can help, and basically giving the emotion a voice, or let the emotion impact your behavior in a certain way so that you become more authentic. And when I do that, I would talk about being set up to fail. A lot of tasks were given to me that were absolutely inappropriate for the level that I was at. Like, you cannot give a child an entire book to read if, the kid barely can read. Like, what do you expect to happen? So that is one part that makes me angry. Another one would be that there is responsibility on the side of the teacher as well. You cannot just communicate to the child, well, you're dyslexic, so you're the problem. That is also not okay. And then there are things like public humiliation, where your weakness is shown off in front of the entire class, like putting some salt into the wound. And yeah, that is also an element that makes me angry, that is something that was allowed to happen in that way. And it's unbelievable to me that these kind of things are still happening. So me telling you about my suppressed anger towards the education system is a form of unmasking. And you might be able to do something similar by talking to a friend about your diagnoses. Now, if you're not entirely sure what needs to be unmasked or what of your shadow needs to be integrated, you can think about your resentment. If you have resentment, then that is normally a sign that there's something there that needs to be integrated, an emotion that needs to be given a voice. So that is one way to do it. And if you would like to talk about these things, then feel free to reach out, and we meet and we talk. I hope you really liked this video, and I'll see you in the next one.